Magic Treehouse number 24, Earthquake in the Early Morning by Mary Pope Osborne. Chapter 1. Well, actually, I should read the prologue first in case this is the first one you've heard. One summer day in Frog Creek, Pennsylvania, a mysterious treehouse appeared in the woods. 8-year-old Jack and his 7-year-old sister Annie climbed into the treehouse. They found that it was filled with books. Jack and Annie soon discovered that the treehouse was magic. It could take them to the places in the books. All they had to do was point to a picture and wish to go there. Along the way, Jack and Annie discovered that the treehouse belongs to Morgan Le Fay. Morgan is a magical librarian from Camelot, the long-ago kingdom of King Arthur. She travels through time and space gathering books. In Magic Treehouse books 5 through 8, Jack and Annie helped free Morgan from a spell. In books 9 through 12, they solved 4 ancient riddles and became master librarians. In Magic Treehouse books number 13 through 16, Jack and Annie had to save 4 ancient stories from being lost forever. In Magic Treehouse books 17 to 20, Jack and Annie freed a mysterious little dog from a magic spell. The Magic Treehouse books 21 through 24, Jack and Annie have a new challenge. They must find 4 special kinds of writing for Morgan's library to help save Camelot. They are about to set off to find the third of these. Chapter 1. Tweet, Tweet. Jack sat up in bed. He stared out his window. The sky was dark gray. The sun would be rising soon. It's almost time, he whispered to himself. The day before, in the Magic Treehouse, Morgan's note had said, "Come back tomorrow in the early morning." Jack jumped out of bed. He put on his jeans and t-shirt, and he grabbed his backpack and crept out into the hall. Jack peeked into Annie's room. She wasn't there. He slipped downstairs and out the front door. Annie was sitting on the porch steps. Jack sat down beside her. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I was waiting for the birds to start singing," said Annie. "Then I was going to wake you up." Jack and Annie watched the sky go from dark gray to light gray. Then the birds began their song. "Tweet, tweet," said Annie. Without another word, Jack and Annie left their porch. They headed up their street to the Frog Creek woods. It was cool beneath the trees. Jack and Annie hurried through the woods to the rope ladder. It hung from the tallest oak. At the top of the oak was a magic treehouse. They climbed up into the treehouse. It was barely light inside. Annie picked up the note lying in the floor. She held it to the window and read aloud. "Dear Jack and Annie, Camelot is in trouble. To save the kingdom, please find these 4 special kinds of writing from my library. Something to follow, something to send, something to learn, something to lend. Thank you, Morgan." Jack took a deep breath. "Okay," he said, "we have our first special writing, a list from the Civil War." "We have the second," said Annie. "It's a letter from the Revolutionary War." "And we have the third," said Jack, "a poem from a pioneer schoolhouse." "Now we just need one more," said Annie. "I wonder why we have to find these special writings from Morgan's library," said Jack. "How are they going to save Camelot?" "I don't know," said Annie, "but let's get going so we can solve the mystery. Where's our research book?" They looked around the treehouse. Their Pennsylvania book, the book that always brought them home, was lying in the corner. Beside it was another book. Annie picked it up. "This is it," she said softly. She showed the book's cover to Jack. It said, "San Francisco, California, 1906. "California?" said Jack. "I've always wanted to go to California." "Me too," said Annie. She laughed. "I guess I told Miss Neely the truth after all." "Yes," said Jack, smiling. The Magic Treehouse had taken them to a pioneer school in their last adventure. There Annie had told the teacher, Miss Neely, that they were on their way to California. Annie pointed out the cover of the California book. "We really wish we could go there," she said. The wind started to blow. The treehouse started to spin. It spun faster and faster. Then everything was still. Absolutely still. Chapter 2. Thunder Under the Ground. "Nice clothes," said Annie. Jack opened his eyes. Annie was wearing a blue and white dress with a big sailor collar and white stockings. Jack was wearing brown knee-length pants, a jacket, a cap, and a tie. His backpack had become a leather bag. He and Annie both wore short lace-up boots. The church bell started to ring. Gong, 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 gong. It rang 5 times, said Jack. It must be 5 in the morning. Yeah, said Annie. She was looking out the window. Jack looked with her. The early morning air felt fresh and cool. The tree house had landed in a tree that at the bottom of a hill. Painted wooden houses and gas lights lined a quiet cobblestone street. A trolley car moved along the tracks up the street. It rounded the top of the hill and disappeared. Tall buildings towered farther off. The sun was behind them, making pink streaks in the blue sky. It's really pretty here, said Annie. Yeah, said Jack. He opened the research book and read. On Wednesday, April 18th, 1906, San Francisco was the biggest city on the west coast of the United States. It had a population of 500,000 people. It was also one of the loveliest cities in the country. Jack pulled out his notebook. He wrote, San Francisco, April 18, 1906, biggest city in the west. Lovely. Let's go, Annie said impatiently. Jack looked back at the book. He wanted to learn more. Now, said Annie. She took the book and notebook away from him and put them into his leather bag. Let's not waste any more time. Annie left the treehouse. Doing research is not wasting time, Jack called after her. But he slung his bag over his shoulder and followed Annie down the rope ladder. When they had both stepped onto the grass, Jack looked around. Where to? He said. Anywhere, said Annie. Let's just explore and see the sights. We can be tourists. Okay, said Jack. Don't forget, we have to find a writing for Morgan's library. They started up the cobblestone street. As they walked up the steep hill, the sun rose above the tall buildings. The early light turned everything gold to gold. Stone street lamps and glass windows of silent houses. It's so quiet and peaceful, said Annie. Yeah, everyone must still be sleeping, said Jack. Suddenly, out of the quiet came a deep rumbling noise. Jack stopped. He grabbed Annie's arm. What's that? He said. The noise got louder. It sounded like thunder coming from under the ground. The earth started shaking. Church bells clanged wildly. The whole street began to move. The cobblestones rolled like waves in the ocean. What's happening? Annie cried. Chimneys fell off roofs. Gas lights toppled over. Big bricks crashed to the street. Get down, shouted Jack. Cover your head. Jack and Annie crouched on the ground with their arms over their heads. All around them was rumbling, clanging, crashing, and breaking. Then the world grew still. The rumbling stopped. Jack and Annie raised their heads. The air was filled with dust. It's over, said Jack. That must have been an earthquake, said Annie. I think so, Jack agreed. I guess I should have let you do a little more research on this place, Annie said. Yeah, probably, said Jack. Except I don't know exactly what we would have done. Jack slowly stood up. His legs felt wobbly. As he brushed off his pants, the deep rumbling came again, louder than before. Then the terrible shaking started. It was even harder than before. Jack was hurled to the ground. The earth trembled and quaked. Jack bounced against the hard cobblestones. Annie, he cried. He tried to stand, but he fell again. Through the dusty air, he saw the tall buildings swaying against the sky. Roofs were caving in. Up and down the streets, bricks, glass, and concrete showered down. It seemed like a long time before the dreadful noise and shaking finally stopped. Chapter 3. The Great Shake. A cloud of dust billowed around Jack. He could hardly breathe. He couldn't see, but he could hear Annie coughing. Jack opened his mouth to call her, but dust filled his throat. Jack! Between coughs, Annie shouted his name. Jack! I'm here, he said hoarsely. I think I'm in trouble, she said. Jack tried to sit up. He hurt all over. His clothes were ripped and covered with dirt. His cap was gone. Where are you? He called. Here, said Annie. Jack started to stand, but he fell down again. His legs were like rubber. Where? He repeated. Jack cleaned his glasses, then looked around, but he still couldn't see Annie through the thick haze of dust. I fell into the ground, said Annie. Jack crawled in the direction of Annie's voice. Keep talking, he said. Here, she coughed. Here! Jack felt a ledge with his hands. He looked down to a huge crack in the street. Through the dust he could see Annie right below him. You found me, she said between coughs. I'll pull you out, said Jack. He grabbed Annie's hands. He tried to pull her out of the crack, but she was too heavy. I can't do it, he said. Bring me something to stand on, Annie said. Maybe I can get out by myself. Jack stood up and stumbled away from the crack. He gathered an armload of bricks and he went back to the crack and handed them down to Annie one by one. Annie carefully stacked the bricks on top of each other. I need more, she said. Jack ran to get more bricks. He was afraid there'd be another earthquake and the crack would close with Annie inside. He handed the bricks down to her. Hurry, he said. I'm hurrying, she said. At last, Annie finished stacking the bricks. She stood on the stack with her bare hands and slowly pulled herself up. Jack helped her stand. She was covered with dirt. Her stockings were torn. Her knees were skinned. Are you hurt? Jack asked. A little scraped, said Annie. How about you? A little shaky, said Jack. Actually, he was very shaky. Me too, said Annie. I think San Francisco just had a really huge earthquake, Jack said. He coughed. His throat was clogged with dust. Annie coughed too. What's the book say? She said. Jack pulled out his research book from his leather bag. His hands were trembling. He could hardly turn the pages. I'll find it, said Annie. She took the book from him and found the picture of a torn-up street. She read aloud. At 5:13 a.m. on April 18, 1906, the people of San Francisco were shaken awake by one of the biggest earthquakes the United States has ever known. Some call it the Great Shake. No wonder we feel shaky, said Jack. I wonder if a lot of people got hurt, said Annie. They looked around. Through the dust-filled air, families were stumbling out of their crumbling houses. They were all barefoot and still wore their nightclothes. Some babies and small children were crying, but strangely, the grown-ups were all silent. They just stared at the torn-up street and crumbling houses. Everyone must be in shock, said Annie. I know how they feel, said Jack. He gazed at the rubble all around him. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't think clearly. Annie looked at the book again. She read aloud. Just after the earthquake, broken chimneys, stoves, and lamps caused terrible fires. The fires raged for 3 days, nearly destroying all of San Francisco. Over 28,000 buildings burned down. That's terrible, breathed Jack. In the distance, a cloud of black smoke was rolling through the sky. The fires are starting, said Annie.